Good morning, everyone. This is one of my favorite things. It's when I get a comment on the channel that easily and quickly becomes a video. And I really like that. A, because it's fun for me. B, because I get to answer someone's question in a way that is, I think, more fulfilling than just a text answer, which I actually, in this case, gave a quick text answer, but was like, this is a good idea for a video. So let's talk about the differences between materials for kayaks. Let's go. Okay, really, we've got three different types of materials, and I actually had a little bit of help with this. As the comment came in, I was already headed back to Greensboro, where I sometimes live, and I was going to see a friend of mine who is a paddling instructor and owns an outdoor store, a store called Get Outdoors. He owns and runs this store. And so I was able to chat with him about this topic a little bit. His name is Will, great guy, great paddler, super helpful. But when I got there, there was a surprise in the parking lot, which I'll talk about later. So that was a great opportunity for me to he has all three materials that we generally deal with in his shop, which is super useful. Then it turned out that I was invited to visit a guy that I had never met before, but had interacted with online, a guy named Joey, who runs Turning Point Boatworks in Richmond, Virginia. He was having an event with a bunch of paddlers where he was going to demo vacuum infusion, and we'll talk about that a little bit later as well. But when I was there, I got to see some really wonderful boats as well. It was perfect timing for these sort of things to come together to make a video. And so I appreciate both Will and Joey for helping me out with this. Primarily, we have three different kinds of materials for boats. And like everything in the outdoors, there's huge trade-offs in these three materials. And so the first and most common is a plastic boat that is generally referred to as either roto-molded or polyethylene or poly, or roto, just straight up roto. This is like your most common first boat, your entry-level boat. You can get just about any kind of boat that you want made out of roto-molded plastic. They are incredibly durable. The way that I describe them is if you're driving down the highway and you do a bad job of tying the boat up on the roof of your car and it blows off the roof, you stop, apologize to the car behind you, put the boat back on the roof and go kayaking. That's how durable they are. Really incredible. But they're also a little bit heavier, and they're the most flexible of all of these boats. They've got the most flex when you're paddling them. Another thing that is not this is not a real thing. When I paddle them, they feel dead to me. And I think that that's the flexibility. They just don't have the snap of some of the other materials that we're talking about. But you can get to sit-on tops, to fishing kayaks, to recreational kayaks, straight up to full-blown touring kayaks. Even companies like P&H make versions of their boats in roto-molded plastic. In general, price is lower. In general, weight is heavier. In general, more durable. I might have already said that. So great first option. And the way these boats are made is a two-piece mold. You apply little beads, or it really looks like powder to me, into the mold, seal the mold up tight. It goes in an oven, gets heated and rotated all the way around. The powder or beads become a liquid which fills the inside of the mold. Pull it out, take it apart, cut off the edges, you got a kayak. You add stickers, seats, hatch covers, stuff like that. My first boat was a roto-molded touring kayak, a Perception Shadow, which was the lower volume version of the Eclipse. Really, I loved that boat. Number two, and this is what's up on the roof. This is thermoformed plastic, which is also called ultralight, aerolite, things like that. And it gets those other names because it is lighter than a roto-molded boat. I've been paddling Thermoformed since 2009 and was immediately impressed with it. It feels like a fiberglass boat, so it is, in general, lighter than a roto-molded boat. It is, in general, stiffer than a roto-molded boat. It's not quite as durable. but is relatively easy to fix. But it's harder to make it look factory fresh. In fact, I'm going to go out on a limb and say even someone as skilled as Joey can't probably make it look factory fresh. But in terms of structurally sound, it's fine. I did one little repair on my last Delta. It had a little tiny crack in it. I talked to Joey about process, and he uses the same process as me. He just does a way better job at it. And so, in general, lighter, stiffer, a little bit more expensive. I absolutely love my Thermoform boat. Ticks a lot of boxes for me. It's not ridiculously expensive. I could afford to buy it. It holds a lot of gear. It paddles mostly like a fiberglass boat, which I really like. It's pretty snappy. It's pretty responsive. I can repair it if I break it. Yeah, super happy with Thermoformed. And a lot of people go Thermoformed because of the weight factor. That's the deciding factor on boats for a surprising number of people, is I have to be able to get this on the roof by myself. And I can see that, and that's what sends a lot of people towards things like inflatables or folding kayaks, things like that, which we're not going to get into today. Your third option is a fiberglass boat, which is also sometimes called a composite boat. And generally this is a thin piece of fiberglass cloth sandwiched between epoxy resin with a gel coat. And I may screw this up a little bit. I've done minor repairs, but I've never actually seen the process, but we'll get there in one second. These boats are generally a little heavier, with an asterisk, we'll get to that. Generally a little bit heavier than Thermoformed, generally more expensive. They are the stiffest of the three and the most responsive, but they are expensive. Hey everyone, I just want to interrupt for 1 minute. I realized that I did something different in talking about the fiberglass kayaks or the composite kayaks. When I talked about the other two boat materials, the Roto-molded and the Thermoformed, I started with pros and then I moved on to cons. And with the fiberglass boats, I started with the cons, and that was unfair of me. And in watching the edit, I realized that it's a clear case of implicit bias. I have to say, for the record, I've paddled hundreds of fiberglass boats. I love fiberglass boats. For me, the biggest problem with fiberglass boats is that I can't afford one. I get to paddle them, or got to paddle them when I worked for Knowles. I've paddled them at trade shows. I've done some trips in them. They are amazing boats. I just can't afford them. So if you think that bias doesn't affect the things we say or the way that we act, you just saw it. That was my bias about the cost of fiberglass boats. They glide through the water beautifully. They are just amazing boats, and I can't afford one. Okay, back to the stuff. So if you're going to go buy a fiberglass touring kayak, you're probably starting at $3,500 or $4,000. If you're looking to buy a thermoformed kayak, you're probably looking between $1,800 and $2,500. And if you're looking for a touring kayak, if you're looking at a roto-molded boat, you are generally looking for a touring kayak, between $700 and $1,500. So those are general price ranges. There's always some variation. So I said that the fiberglass boats are generally the heaviest. There is a fair amount of variation here. And that brings us to what I saw at Turning Point Boat Works. So we were there to see vacuum infusion, and I talked to Joey about this. There are a handful of smaller companies that are making vacuum infused boats versus a regular laid up fiberglass boat, where someone is laying fiberglass into a mold and applying epoxy resin to hold that shape. Then they pull it out of the mold, they make it in two pieces and slap it together. Joey demonstrated a method to do it where you put everything in a bag and vacuum seal all the air out of it, and then you inject your epoxy resin back into the bag, and that vacuum draws it in, and it gives them the ability to precisely add as much epoxy resin as needed, as opposed to just adding epoxy resin until everything looks good. And the byproduct of that is the boat weighs less because there is no unnecessary epoxy resin. I'm gonna expect Joey to make comments down below when he sees this and he's like, Brett, you're describing this completely wrong or completely inadequately. I'm sure I'm getting something wrong. In general, that's the process. I was super impressed with seeing this process. Joey is doing something else that I thought was super cool. So As I mentioned, in a normal fiberglass boat, you'll use a thin sheet of fiberglass cloth as sort of the base, and then lock that into place, essentially using epoxy. He's using a combination product called base salt and a Negra, and this is also where I might screw this up. This is the most cutting edge form of boat that there is. And I asked him for some pictures of one. He had a Petrel in his shop, which I will put up. Here's pictures of the Petrel. Really beautiful boat. And the base salt and Negra makes, the base salt is replacing, I think, the fiberglass, and then it's layered with Negra, which is weaves going in 3 directions, whereas fiberglass's weave is only going 2 directions, which gives us much more strength in the hull. It also weighs less. It's also really strong. This immediately got me fantasizing about a base salt Negra touring kayak. And so I asked him, you know, what can I do to get into one of these boats? And he recommended a couple companies, and you're looking at like a $7,000 boat. But those weights are down in the 40-pound range versus my boat up top weighs 52 pounds. So much lighter, much stiffer, much more expensive. But that is really the most cutting edge, and I was super impressed with it. Now, contrast that to what I saw at Get Outdoors. So as soon as I pulled up, I saw in front of their store on the top of a truck a kayak that piqued my interest. And the thing that piqued my interest was, from a distance, I noticed the rudder. And I thought to myself, that rudder assembly is old school. That has got to be an old boat. I should point out, Greensboro, North Carolina, is where Wilderness Systems Kayaks was founded. And so frequently you will see a boat that is really old and in great shape or something like that, because so many people in the Greensboro area at some time worked for Wilderness Systems. Wilderness Systems has since been sold and is now based in Easley, South Carolina, but the founders were in Greensboro, North Carolina. And I've actually run into one of the founders a number of times paddling. He's a great guy. I walked up to this boat and started looking at it, and the thing that got me was I couldn't identify it. So I went inside, I asked whose boat it was. I got introduced to a great guy named Rick, who in fact was employee number 1 after the 2 founders at Wilderness Systems. And it was a boat that he had made, and then the boat had been sold, and then he got it back. And it was a Wilderness Systems Esprit. I forget how long. I feel like he said it might have been 14 feet or 16 feet. I'm not really sure, but I had never heard of Wilderness Systems Esprit. I had never seen one before. He said it was about a 30-year-old boat, and it was in beautiful shape. And that is a really nice benefit of fiberglass, is if it's well maintained, it'll last forever. Whereas plastic kayaks, 10 to 15 years, and you'll start to see some effects from UV. I think Joey mentioned that the UV on the Thermoform boats, it does better than UV protection on the Roto-molded poly boats. So those boats don't do as well sitting in the sun, whereas the Thermoform boats do a little bit better. And I think the newer Thermoform boats do even better. This boat is doing way better than my Delta did. The inside of my old Delta completely discolored from UV. And so something to keep in mind. But this was an absolutely gorgeous boat, and it was super neat to see a boat that old. And the guy that I spoke to who owned it had we talked for about 40 minutes. He had a million stories about Wilderness Systems and starting out in the company. And just essentially, as employee number 1, he did a little bit of everything and had a great time doing it. Okay, that is the 3 types of materials we primarily see used to manufacture kayaks. If you have questions, let me know down below. If you're just getting started in paddling, you can find my books on Amazon. They will help you get started paddling and kayak camping and stuff like that. If you want to support the channel, you can always buy me a coffee down below. Have a great day. I'll see you on the water.